Last time we discussed the relation between the mental lexicon and the public lexicon, that is, the concepts that we can entertain in our mind and the words we have at our disposal to express these concepts. And the conclusion was that there are far more concepts in our mind than words that can convey their meaning, which means that encoded words are treated just as inputs to further inferential processes. And today we'll perhaps concentrate on this process of inferential derivation of the intended meaning, that is, the pragmatics of online concept constructions, in more details. We'll discuss this process in more details. Thus, we will try to follow this very long road from linguistically encoded meaning to the explicitly conveyed thought. Now let's start from an encoded concept, and perhaps we'll just concentrate on an atomic concept which consists of an address in memory, and this address in memory makes available three kinds of information. First of all, logical content, then encyclopedic knowledge, and finally lexical properties. So if you consider the example cat and think of its logical content, you know that it is an animal of a certain kind. So there are certain rules that can be derived from the word cat, okay? And these rules are of purely logical character. Encyclopedic knowledge is all we know about cats, so it may be commonplace assumptions, scientific information, culture-specific beliefs, whatever we know about cats, so our general knowledge about cats. And finally, lexical properties, so phonetic form, phonological and syntactic properties. Now, some concepts lack one or two entries. For example, or, which is a conjunction, has no encyclopedic entry, so you do not have any propositional knowledge about or. On the other hand, best childhood friend has no lexical entry, that is, we know quite a lot about people who can be called best childhood friends, and there are certain logical properties that can be derived from that, but there is no single lexical entry for that. And finally, proper names do not have any logical properties. So as you can see, some concepts are not complete in the sense that three kinds of information are available. Now, this encoded concept should be treated as a starting point, as a pro-concept, okay? So something that can be compared to an indexical expression. And perhaps you remember that what characterizes an indexical expression is that it obviously possesses an ingredient of meaning that is invariant, but the vast part of its meaning is established contextually. And now the claim is that, in fact, all encoded concepts have to be contextually enriched. So what we do, in fact, use in the process of communication are ad hoc concepts rather than encoded concepts. That is, of course, we use encoded concepts, but then they are converted to ad hoc concepts. So an ad hoc concept can be defined as pragmatically constructed by a hearer in the process of utterance comprehension. So a speaker uses a lexically encoded concept to communicate a distinct, non-lexicalized concept which resembles the encoded concept in that it shares some elements of its logical and encyclopedic entries. So you remember, because we discussed such concepts last time, so you might remember I'm tired, so the concept of tiredness, or Italian food, a peculiar meaning of Italian food. Now, the hearer can pragmatically infer the intended concept on the basis of the encoded one. So ad hoc concepts are not linguistically given, but are constructed online in response to specific expectations of relevance. Obviously, this is a result of tremendous flexibility of human conceptual capacity that we discussed last week. Mind you that ad hoc concepts do not have to be entirely novel occurrences. It may happen that they are, but you may use a pretty common word such as tired or happy and convey a circumstantial meaning, that is a particular degree of tiredness or a particular sense of happiness, okay, for example bliss, or just the feeling of satisfaction. So the meaning is specific, though not entirely novel. Thus we may say that the encoded concept undergoes the process of enrichment. And perhaps you remember, because we discussed various types of enrichment when talking about underdeterminacy of language, that one way to enrich such a context is to narrow it down. So now we will discuss the process of narrowing. One type of enrichment where the pragmatic process targets a lexical item and strengthens the concept it encodes. So if I say that Anne is happy, I have in mind a particular sense of happiness, because Anne may be nearly glad or Anne may be elated, and which of that is intended depends on the contextual interpretation. Now, if I say I want to meet, well, perhaps not I, but if a young girl says I want to meet some bachelors, she may have in mind someone with whom she would be in a serious relationship. Thus, not all possible bachelors, it is not all unmarried men, are eligible here, right? So she is not interested in bachelors over 80, for instance, or she is not interested in Catholic priests, who are technically bachelors as well. Now, the birds wheeled above the waves, so we mean seabirds. The path is uneven, again, a particular aspect of being uneven. Tom has a brain, which is a trivial truth, again. We mean that he has a very good brain, that he is intelligent, a very specific meaning of the word brain. Something has happened, again, the assumption is that something unexpected or something bad must have happened. So perhaps you can recall the examples that we discussed last time when we discussed the verb open. Jane opened the window, Bill opened his mouth, Sally opened her book to page 37, Mike opened his briefcase, Pat opened the curtains, the child opened the package, the carpenter opened the wall, the surgeon opened the wound. So as you can see, the activity of opening is visualized in a different way each time we use the verb. So in other words, we may say that the same encoding conveys a completely different concept. Obviously, these concepts share something in common, but they are distinct. So, in all these cases, the extension of the concept, pragmatically constructed, is a subset of the extension of the lexical concept from which it has been derived. Mind you that this kind of enrichment is free, so it is not mandatory, as is the case for scalar adjectives. So if you say that something is fast or faster or rich, then you need the context to decide according to what criteria. Okay, fast as compared to what, rich as compared to what. So this can be called a mandatory enrichment, whereas here if you say that Anne is happy, this is not a mandatory enrichment. This is a completely free process that is context-dependent and circumstantial. But the concept pragmatically derived is included, or can be included, in the lexical concept. So this is what is meant by the first sentence of the last paragraph, that the extension of the concept pragmatically constructed is a subset of the extension of the lexical concept from which it has been derived. So we've discussed the process of narrowing, and this is just one way in which a particular encoded concept can be pragmatically interpreted, that is, created online. And now we can proceed to the discussion of the other process, which is loosening. Loosening or concept broadening. Okay? So mind you that very frequently we used concepts loosely. There is a rectangle of lawn at the back. The steak is raw. We play continuous classics. Ken's is a real bachelor, where Ken is technically married. Here's my flatmate, referring to a cat. Jim's bedroom is a rubbish dump. Mary is a bulldozer. So if you think at the first 3 or 4 or 5 even examples, so we may say that these are just loose uses, or perhaps starting from E, they are already metaphors, but metaphors are just also represent loose use of language. That is, if you say that it is a rectangle of lawn, or that his face is, that he has a square face, then we do not mean it literally. So in fact, it is not quite true. It is false, because, you know, rectangle or square are geometrical figures, and they are very strictly defined. And obviously his face cannot be exactly a square. Nevertheless, we use it to refer to the shape of his face, which is an approximation of some kind. Again, if we say that the steak is raw, this is probably exaggerated. We are not satisfied with what has been offered, and we just say that it is not as it should be, but it does not exactly mean that it is literally raw. Now, we play continuous classics does not mean that there is no pause, that there are no news programs, for instance, because you know, there might be some other pauses, like the news or some commentaries from the radio announcers, but nevertheless we say we play continuous classics. So it is, again, loose use of continuous. It's not literally true. Now the next one, Ken is a real bachelor, when Ken is technically married, can be used in the situation when you want to say that Ken behaves in a irresponsible way, that he is a wife and 4 children, but nevertheless he goes out every night and takes around numerous bars and enjoys himself. So this is, again, something that is literally not true. Now here's my flatmate, referring to a cat, again. Metaphorical use of flatmate. Jim's bedroom is a rubbish dump, metaphorical use of the rubbish dump, but we obviously can imagine the condition of that bedroom. And Mary is a bulldozer. Again, it is about some features of Mary that should somehow be derived or should be implied by the use of the word bulldozer, but obviously none of these can be interpreted literally. So mind you that in each case a logical or defining feature of the lexically encoded content is dropped in the process of arriving at the intended interpretation. So you simply have to give up a defining feature, like being married, okay? Or like being raw, literally raw. So again, notice that all these sentences represent pragmatically motivated cases and not semantic vagueness. It is not that we cannot say whether something is rouge or mauve. It is not that kind of semantic vagueness. It is just pragmatically motivated, because either something is a square or is not a square. So the category of a square has a clear-cut boundaries, so it is not a fuzzy category. In fact, we are not even aware of how often we communicate loosely. That is, we make use of loose use of language. So loose use is a pervasive phenomenon, which should not be surprising if we bear in mind that we have this capacity of mind reading. So our mind reading communicative capacities make it possible for us to infer and to interpret something that is apparently false as meaningful. So linguistic system is just merely provides the clues or pointers to further processing, and that's why we can understand loose use as not confusing or deceptive in any way. Perhaps you remember the concept of the interpretive use, and the general claim made by relevance theory is that utterances do not come with a presumption of truth, but they come with a presumption of relevance. So utterances do not come with a presumption that the proposition they express is true, or that it is a literal interpretation of the thought being communicated. Utterances come with a presumption of optimal relevance, and it is sometimes more relevant to say something plainly false. So if we say let's do banku, this is plainly false, because obviously I cannot, I do not fly, I just run. Perhaps I'm in a hurry, but I do not even run. I walk fast, perhaps. So this is what we mean by relevance and not truth. So we may use something that is not literally true. We may use some kind of an exaggeration, but nevertheless the addressee will not be deceived in any way and will be able to understand the message properly. In fact, perhaps loose use is more optimal than expressing oneself literally, because it saves a lot of effort. So that's why we use approximations, for instance, when giving numbers, when providing time, when estimating space, distance. So we just give approximations because they are easier to process for the addressee. So they are more relevant than literal interpretation in many cases. What follows should be treated as a digression, because in fact it is an academic problem, as for a long time these two processes, narrowing and broadening, were considered to be distinct, in that the first of them was believed to contribute to the explicature, to contribute to the propositional form, whereas the second was claimed to contribute to the implicit level, that is, to the implicature. So that was a position adopted by Sperber and Wilson originally. And now I would like to convince you, following Robin Carsten, that they are in fact two symmetrical processes, and that they should be treated as complementary and contributing to one and the same level. So broadening and narrowing look like two symmetrical processes of pragmatic constructing a new concept from a lexically encoded one. They are two possible outcomes of a single process of picking and choosing from elements of logical and encyclopedic information that are made available by the encoded concept. So there is no question that the process of narrowing represents enrichment, and as such does contribute to the propositional content, that is, to the explicature of an utterance. The problem arises with loose use. Now, it seems that in fact the only difference between narrowing and loosening is that in the course of narrowing all logical properties are retained, whereas in the case of loosening some are dropped. However, both seem to be conceptual adjustments that do contribute to the proposition expressed. And next examples are to convince you that, in fact, the process of loosening also contributes to the proposition expressed, that is, to the explicit level. Mind you that now we will simply place loosely used concept under the scope of a logical operator. So just let's have a look at the example. If Mary is a bulldozer, she will be ideal on the committee. Since Mick is a loose cannon at the best of times, I think we should keep him out of any delicate negotiations. So can we go back to the first one? If Mary is a bulldozer, she will be ideal on the committee. So even if you do not know much about Mary, and if you have heard this sentence, you will probably derive a conclusion that Mary can express her opinions bluntly, and that she will be a good representative. So that's why we should include her within the team that is to represent us in the committee. Okay, so this is the implicature that we have derived on the basis of the first sentence. But to derive this implicature, we have to understand what bulldozer means, how bulldozer is used, in what sense bulldozer is used. And I believe that this is how we interpret it, that Mary is a determined person, that Mary is not very delicate, that she is brave. So we simply try to associate certain features, and these features are somehow brought by the encoded term bulldozer, and on the basis of how we determine the meaning of the word bulldozer, we are then capable of deriving the implicature, which means that bulldozer is part of the explicit meaning conveyed in this utterance, which means that it does contribute to the propositional content, which means it is part of the explicature, so it contributes to the explicature. And the same kind of reasoning can be applied to the next sentence. Since Mick is a loose cannon at the best of times, I think we should keep him out of any delicate negotiations. So again, we have to determine the meaning of loose cannon. Loose cannon is a term used loosely, metaphorically. So Mick is quite likely to explode suddenly, and he's not a very delicate person, not very sensitive person, not very well-mannered perhaps, and that is why we should not assign him as someone who will represent us in the negotiations, in particular because these are very delicate negotiations. So again, this implicature that Mick is not the best choice for the negotiations is derived once we have established the propositional meaning of the previous utterance, which means that again the meaning of loose cannon does contribute to the propositional content, that is, to the explicature. So a loosely used lexical concept, such as bulldozer and loose cannon, occurs in the syntactic scope of a conditional in the first case. Okay? The ad hoc concept formed by broadening the lexical concept is understood as contributing to the antecedent of the conditional, that is, if Mary is a bulldozer, this is what we call antecedent, and so is a constituent of the truth conditional content of the utterance. So I believe I've managed to convince you that both loosely used concept and narrowly used concept do contribute to the propositional content of an utterance. It is a part of the explicature. Another argument might be that quite frequently both processes have to be accomplished within a single concept. That is, if you want to derive the intended meaning of a particular concept, you actually have to use two processes, that is, loosening and narrowing at the same time, simultaneously, so to say. So, if you remember the example, Ken is a real bachelor, when in fact Ken is technically married, then we may say that the word bachelor in the first sentence is an ad hoc concept, okay, constructed contextually. So this concept, that is marked here with an asterisk, which means created concept, so this concept formed from the encoded concept bachelor applies to Ken, who is technically married, but behaves in the free and easy way of a certain sort of unmarried man. The extension of this concept is all truly unmarried men. Okay, so this is the defining feature, is to be an unmarried man. This is what a bachelor is, plus men who behave like Ken. So we have to loosen the context to include those men who behave like Ken, or to include just Ken. Thus, it means that the linguistic context is included in the constructed concept. So the constructed concept is broader. But mind you that the ad hoc concept, that is all truly unmarried men plus men who behave like Ken, may exclude some unmarried men who live sober, responsible, celibate life. Okay? So these have to be excluded. Thus, we narrow down the meaning of the bachelor only to those men who behave in an irresponsible way. Okay? So the denotations of the lexical concept and the new concept intersect. The relation of conceptual overlap is not one of broadening alone, but also involves some narrowing. A logical property, unmarried, is dropped, but another property is given a defining role, emotionally uncommitted or promiscuous. So we might conclude that both processes are required in forming a communicated ad hoc concept. Both then contribute to the proposition expressed. The following diagrams illustrate three different cases. So the first case, when the lexical concept is broader than the constructed concept, illustrates the process of narrowing. So we simply have to narrow down the scope of available items, so to say, okay? So it is a particular sense of tiredness or a particular sense of happiness. And the encoded concept is broader. Now, the situation is just the opposite in the case of loosening. So here the encoded concept is included with the constructed concept, because in the constructed concept there are those objects that do not possess a defining feature. So we simply have to loosen the concept to allow them within the category. So the second diagram represents a pure case of loosening. And the third diagram at the bottom of the page represents loosening and narrowing taking place simultaneously. So this is our bachelor case. Okay, so Ken is a real bachelor, where Ken is in fact married. So it is loosening because Ken is not married, so we have to loosen the concept, we have to drop up the defining feature, but on the other hand, we have to narrow down the scope, again, of the newly created concept, because we refer only to one particular category of men. So this is just this intersecting picture. And now I would like you to recall what Grice says about metaphors, how Grice interprets metaphors. Perhaps you remember that according to the theory of conversational implicature, metaphors are quality clouds. So the cooperative principle is complied with, but the constituent maxim of quality is flouted. So could you just consider the following utterances? Robert is a bulldozer. Robert is not a bulldozer. Sally is a block of ice. Sally is not a block of ice. And obviously if you look at Robert is a bulldozer, this is a quality flout, so is Sally is a block of ice. But if you look at Robert is not a bulldozer, this is not a quality flout, because apparently the sentence tells the truth. It is obviously trivial truth in a way. We do not need that kind of truth, but it is true. You cannot deny that. Sally is not a block of ice is obvious, but it is true. So we may conclude that negations of metaphorical sentences do not flout quality. And this is interesting. They do not flout quality, but nevertheless they are still recognized as metaphorical. They do not stop being metaphorical. Okay? So negative counterparts are trivial obvious truths which do not flout the quality maxim, but they seem to be no less metaphorical than the positive cases. So the problem is not the truth or falsity, okay, but the applicability or inapplicability of the linguistically encoded predicates, such as bulldozer or block of ice, to human beings. The logical properties of the encoded concepts are dropped in both cases, because Sally is not an emotionally cold person. Sally is not made of solidified H2O. Okay? So, as you can see, this is not the problem of truth or falsity, but the problem of applicability and inapplicability. Thus, we may conclude that perhaps Grice's account of metaphors is somehow fallacious. Let us discuss one more peculiar case, that is metaphorical negations. Harry isn't a lion, he is a pussycat, where Harry actually is a lion. Dr. Lucas isn't a surgeon, he is a butcher, where Dr. Lucas in fact is a surgeon. Sean isn't a human being, he is a beast. So if we know that Harry is a lion, then we understand the first sentence, that Harry is not a very dangerous lion, that Harry is not particularly fierce, that he's nice, approachable lion, okay, that can be patted. If we say Dr. Lucas isn't a surgeon, he's a butcher, what we want in fact convey is that Dr. Lucas is not a good surgeon, that he is a very bad surgeon, okay, that and since he's so bad he can be compared to a butcher, he's as bad as that. Sean isn't a human being, Sean is a beast, so again we want to say that Sean is not a particular human being, that Sean is not a sensitive human being. So mind you that the subject referent, that is Ari, Dr. Lucas or Sean, does in fact have the property that the speaker is denying he has, and does not have the property the speaker predicates of him in the next clause. So these sentences are metaphorical, but they can be described as cases where an enriched concept is negated. So the speaker is denying that Harry belongs to a narrower category, which consists of fierce, proud, unapproachable lions, or class of skilled surgeons. okay, or sensitive human beings. So mind you that here it is rather a negated strengthening than a metaphorical negation. So again, you can see that in fact, if we are likely to interpret such cases as negated strengthenings, then we may still claim that this is part of the explicit meaning. What emerges from our discussion is a sort of classification of metaphors. We can divide them into three types. So those where an encoded property is inapplicable to its subject. Sally is a block of ice, so this is a case of typical loosening. Those involving the negation of an inapplicable property. Sally is not a block of ice, again loosening. And those where the property that applies is negated, and this is strengthening. Ari is not a lion. Let us discuss one more case, that is those examples where an encoded property obviously applies to the subject, such as Caroline is our princess, if referred to Caroline of Monaco, or Uncle Bob is a sergeant major, and in fact Uncle Bob is literally a sergeant major. Tom is a human being. So in such cases as the ones above, the pragmatic adjustments of the encoded concept might result either in a narrowing or a loosening. So let's just discuss first narrowing. So if we are back to Caroline of Monaco is our princess, or Caroline is our princess, so we do not drop the logical property of being a female member of the royal house, but we narrow down the term princess to spoiled, pampered, conceited persons. So then it is a narrowing. But it can also be a loosening in the situation when it is uttered as a warning to the addressee who knows nothing about Caroline except for the fact that she is a female member of the royal house. And now if we say Caroline is such a princess, then it is to mean that she is spoiled and pampered, for instance. So then it can be treated as a loosening because the term denotes in its denotation all people who are spoiled and conceited and pampered and not necessarily are female members of the royal house. So as you can see, it can be either a narrowing or a loosening. So quite different concepts may be pragmatically constructed in different contexts from one and the same linguistically encoded concept. So it is a matter of contextual interpretation. It depends on the circumstances where a particular utterance is used. Now here you've got some other examples of the same situation. He is not a human being, he is a wild beast. He is a human being, not a machine. So human being is interpreted in a different way each time we use it. So whether it is narrowing and whether it is narrowing or broadening is a matter of contextual decision. Thus, they cannot be two different processes, they are parallel in a way. So the whole idea of that part of our discussion has been to convince you that in fact loosening and narrowing are two parallel processes, and that loosening as much as narrowing does contribute to the derivation of explicature. And perhaps to provide you some further arguments in favor of that interpretation, let us consider some examples in which concept broadening has to take place before some other processes. For instance, that bulldozer in the back row should be told to leave. Okay, so that bulldozer is a loosely used concept, and it is used in the function of the referring expression. Okay, so first you have to assign, to accomplish the process of reference assignment, and then you may interpret the whole sentence. Okay, and then you may derive the implicature, for instance. You may get up and ask the lady to leave. Or, I was stuck all evening before that robot from IBM. That robot from IBM, again, is used metaphorically, but mind you that it is a referring expression. So you have to identify the referent first, and then you can interpret the whole sentence. So I guess that in that function, the loose use in that function, that you are convinced now that if loose use appears in that function, it is part of the propositional meaning, so it is part of the explicit level. Or one more example, thank goodness the wilting violet has finally left. Again, the same situation. Here the metaphorically used expression is a referring expression. So these examples show that identifying the referent requires a prior pragmatic process of determining the intended ad hoc concept. The conclusion might be that ad hoc concepts, whatever way they are constructed, whether it is just narrowing or whether it is loosening or a combination of the two, do contribute to the propositional content of the utterance, that is a part of the explicature. So I hope that this lecture somehow has indicated or has shown this long road from linguistically encoded meaning to the thought explicitly communicated.